The missing person report came from a woman in California who hadn't heard from her adult son in 8 months. He'd moved to the county 2 years earlier, after attending what he described as a spiritual retreat that had changed his life. He'd called regularly at first, enthusiastic about the community he'd joined and the purpose he'd found. Then the calls became less frequent, shorter, more guarded. Eventually, they stopped entirely. The mother had tried calling the number her son had been using. It was disconnected. She'd sent letters to the address he'd provided. They came back marked undeliverable. She'd searched online and found minimal information about the group he'd joined, just a basic website describing a faith community focused on simple living and spiritual growth. Her attempts to contact them through the website went unanswered. Deputy Ramirez took the case on a Tuesday morning. The address associated with the group was a compound on 80 acres of rural property, accessed by a private road that wound through dense forest. The property had been purchased 6 years earlier by an organization called the Sanctuary of Divine Light. County records showed it was registered as a religious nonprofit, which meant certain protections and limitations on how law enforcement could investigate. Deputy Ramirez drove out to the property with Deputy Kim as backup. The entrance was marked by a simple wooden sign and a locked gate. No fence extended beyond the gate area, just the natural barrier of thick woods on both sides. They parked and walked to the gate, where an intercom system allowed communication with whoever controlled access. Deputy Ramirez pressed the call button and identified himself, explaining he was following up on a welfare check request for a specific individual. After a long pause, a calm male voice responded, asking them to wait. 10 minutes passed with no further communication. Deputy Ramirez called again, this time more firmly stating that they needed to speak with someone about the missing person report, and would not leave until they did. Eventually, a man appeared walking down the road from deeper within the property. He introduced himself as Brother Michael, one of the community's elders. He was in his 50s, dressed simply, and projected an air of patient authority. He listened to Deputy Ramirez explain the situation, nodded thoughtfully, and said he would check if the individual in question was part of their community. Brother Michael asked them to wait while he consulted records. He disappeared back up the road. Another 15 minutes passed. When he returned, he confirmed that the person they were asking about was indeed a member of their community and was doing well. The individual had chosen to limit contact with his previous life as part of his spiritual journey, which was common during the intensive early phases of their program. Deputy Ramirez asked to speak directly with the individual to confirm his well-being. Brother Michael explained that this would be difficult, as members were in a period of silent contemplation and breaking that would disrupt important spiritual work. He could arrange a conversation in a few days if the deputies wanted to return. This didn't satisfy Deputy Ramirez. A mother had filed a missing person report. The individual hadn't been seen or heard from in 8 months. Religious freedom didn't override the need to verify someone's safety. He informed Brother Michael they needed to confirm the individual's well-being immediately, either by speaking with him directly or by being allowed onto the property to verify his presence and safety. Brother Michael's demeanor shifted slightly, the patience becoming strained. He explained that allowing outsiders onto the property would violate the community's sacred space, and that forcing such an intrusion would infringe on their religious rights. He again offered to arrange a meeting in a few days, but insisted it couldn't happen immediately. Deputy Ramirez made a judgment call. Without evidence of immediate danger or probable cause to believe a crime was being committed, he couldn't force entry onto private property held by a religious organization. But he could apply pressure through official channels. He informed Brother Michael that if they couldn't verify the individual's well-being within 24 hours, he would be returning with appropriate legal authorization. Back at the station, Deputy Ramirez researched the Sanctuary of Divine Light more thoroughly. What he found was concerning. The organization had been investigated in 2 other states for allegations of cult behavior, including claims that members were held against their will, subjected to psychological manipulation, and cut off from outside contact. No charges had ever been filed, but the pattern of complaints was troubling. He also found online accounts from former members describing their experiences. The stories were remarkably consistent. People joined believing they were entering a supportive spiritual community. Once inside, They were gradually isolated from outside relationships, told that family and former friends were negative influences on their spiritual growth. They were subjected to intensive indoctrination sessions, sleep deprivation under the guise of meditation practices, and pressure to donate all personal assets to the community. Former members described a hierarchical structure with an inner circle of elders who controlled every aspect of members' lives: what they ate, when they slept, who they could speak with, what work they performed. Punishment for questioning leadership or attempting to leave included public humiliation, isolation in small rooms for days, and threats that leaving would result in spiritual damnation or physical harm. Deputy Ramirez brought this information to his supervisor. Sergeant Hayes agreed the situation warranted deeper investigation, but acknowledged the legal complexities. Religious organizations had strong protections. They needed clear evidence of illegal activity before they could obtain a warrant to. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A woman appeared at the sheriff's office 2 days later, disheveled and exhausted. She'd escaped from the sanctuary compound the previous night, climbing through a window after months of looking for an opportunity. Her name was Emily, and she'd been at the compound for 14 months. Her story confirmed that Emily described systematic control and abuse disguised as spiritual practice. New members were welcomed warmly and encouraged to attend retreats where they would undergo intensive spiritual transformation. These retreats involved sleep deprivation, repetitive indoctrination sessions, and emotional manipulation designed to break down their resistance to the group's ideology. Once members were sufficiently indoctrinated, they were pressured to make permanent commitments, selling their homes and vehicles, transferring assets to the organization, cutting ties with family members who weren't part of the community. They were told this was necessary to achieve spiritual purity, and that material attachments and outside relationships were obstacles to enlightenment. Members lived in communal dormitories separated by gender. Days were structured around work assignments that benefited the community, with members performing agricultural labor, construction, cleaning, and other tasks from early morning until late evening. Between work sessions were mandatory group meetings where the leader, who called himself the shepherd, delivered teachings that emphasized absolute obedience and warned against the evil of the outside world. Anyone who questioned the teachings or expressed doubt was subjected to correction sessions. These involved being isolated in small rooms called reflection chambers, sometimes for days, with minimal food and water. During isolation, members were required to write confession statements detailing their spiritual failures and pledging renewed commitment. If their confessions were deemed insufficient, the isolation continued. Physical punishment was also used, though carefully to avoid leaving obvious marks. Emily describes seeing members struck, forced to hold painful positions for extended periods, or subjected to exhausting physical tasks as punishment. The violence was always framed as necessary for spiritual growth, tools to help members overcome their weakness and achieve purity. The sanctuary also controlled all communication with the outside world. Members had no access to phones, internet, or mail unless it was monitored and approved by the elders. Family members who tried to visit were turned away, or, if allowed onto the property, could only speak with their loved ones in supervised settings where members had been coached on what to say. Emily estimated there were approximately 35 people living at the compound, ranging in age from late teens to mid-60s. Most had been there for at least a year. Some had been there since the community's founding 6 years earlier. She knew the person Deputy Ramirez had been looking for. He was still there, deeply indoctrinated and serving as one of the shepherd's trusted assistants. Armed with Emily's testimony, law enforcement could now pursue a warrant. Her escape provided probable cause to believe others were being held against their will. A judge authorized a search warrant for the property, with specific authorization to check on the well-being of all individuals present and to investigate allegations of unlawful imprisonment and assault. The tactical team assembled early on a Thursday morning. This wasn't a simple welfare check anymore. They were potentially entering a compound where 35 people were being held by a group that had demonstrated willingness to use violence and psychological control. The operation required careful planning to ensure the safety of potential victims while securing any suspects. The team approached the property at dawn, blocking the main entrance while additional units positioned themselves around the perimeter to prevent anyone from fleeing into the surrounding forest. The gate was breached and vehicles moved up the private road toward the compound's main buildings. The property was larger and more developed than satellite imagery had suggested. The main structure was a converted barn that served as a communal meeting hall and living quarters. Surrounding it were several smaller buildings, dormitories, storage facilities, workshops, and what appeared to be agricultural processing areas. The compound was largely self-sufficient, growing food and producing goods that were sold at local markets. Officers announced themselves loudly, explaining they had a warrant and demanding that all occupants assemble in a central location. People emerged slowly from various buildings, most wearing simple clothing and looking confused or frightened. The shepherd himself appeared from the main building, flanked by two men who appeared to be security or enforcers. The shepherd projected calm authority, greeting the officers and asking what had prompted this intrusion into their peaceful community. Sergeant Hayes explained they were executing a warrant based on allegations of unlawful imprisonment and abuse. The shepherd expressed shock and disappointment, claiming these were lies spread by someone who'd failed to meet the challenges of spiritual growth and was now seeking revenge. While the shepherd spoke, officers were conducting a systematic search of the property. They found the reflection chambers Emily had described, small windowless rooms with nothing but a thin mat on the floor, used for isolating members. They found detailed records of each member's financial contributions, showing hundreds of thousands of dollars transferred to the organization over the years. They found surveillance equipment monitoring common areas and dormitories. Most significantly, they found people who were clearly being held against their will. When officers spoke privately with members, away from the shepherd and his enforcers, many broke down describing the same patterns Emily had reported. They wanted to leave, but were afraid. They'd been told their families had abandoned them, that the outside world was dangerous, that leaving would result in spiritual and possibly physical destruction. The member Deputy Ramirez had originally been looking for was found working in one of the agricultural buildings. When informed his mother had filed a missing person report and was desperate to hear from him, he initially insisted he was fine and had chosen to limit contact. But as the conversation continued and he realized he was speaking with law enforcement who could actually remove him from the property, his composure cracked. He admitted he'd wanted to leave for months but didn't know how. His identification had been taken for safekeeping. He had no money. He'd been told that trying to leave would result in punishment and that his family wouldn't want him back anyway. Over several hours, investigators interviewed all 35 people living at the compound. 23 of them expressed desire to leave immediately. 8 were uncertain, so psychologically conditioned by their time at the compound that they couldn't process the option of departure. 4, including the shepherd and his inner circle, insisted everything was voluntary and that the investigation was persecution of their religious freedom. The shepherd and his 3 primary associates were arrested on charges including kidnapping, assault, fraud, and operating a criminal enterprise under the guise of a religious organization. The charges were serious and well supported by evidence. The financial records alone showed systematic exploitation. The testimony from multiple members established patterns of coercion and abuse. The physical evidence of isolation chambers and surveillance systems demonstrated the control mechanisms. The 23 people who wanted to leave immediately were transported to a facility where they could receive medical evaluation, counseling, and assistance in contacting family members or establishing safe living arrangements. Many had no resources, having given everything to the sanctuary. Some had no family to return to, which had made them vulnerable to the cult's recruitment in the first place. The medical evaluations revealed widespread health issues. Multiple individuals were malnourished despite the compound's agricultural production, as higher quality food was reserved for the shepherd and inner circle, while regular members ate minimal rations. Several had untreated injuries or chronic conditions that should have received medical attention. One woman had a respiratory infection that had progressed to pneumonia because she'd been denied permission to rest or seek treatment. Psychological evaluations documented severe trauma. Years of indoctrination, isolation, sleep deprivation, and abuse had left deep scars. Many members exhibited symptoms consistent with Stockholm Syndrome, simultaneously recognizing they had been abused while defending aspects of the organization, or expressing residual belief in the shepherd's teachings. Deprogramming would require extensive therapy and time. The investigation into the sanctuary's finances revealed the full scope of the fraud. Over 6 years, members had contributed approximately $3 million in cash, property transfers, and labor. The shepherd had lived comfortably while members lived in near-poverty conditions. He'd maintained personal bank accounts separate from the organization, purchased property in his own name, and established offshore accounts that suggested plans for eventual disappearance if the operation was ever exposed. The labor performed by members had generated additional revenue. Agricultural products sold at farmers' markets, construction work performed for local residents, and goods manufactured on the property had brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Members received no compensation for this work, with all proceeds going to the organization, which meant going to the shepherd and his inner circle. As investigators traced the sanctuary's origins, they discovered it was the latest iteration of similar operations the shepherd had run in 2 previous states. Each time, he'd established a religious community, recruited vulnerable people, extracted their assets and labor, then disappeared before authorities could build cases against him. He'd left trails of traumatized former members and families devastated by having loved ones drawn into his operations. This time, Emily's escape and willingness to testify had interrupted the pattern. Instead of disappearing before accountability arrived, the shepherd was in custody facing charges that would likely keep him imprisoned for decades. The prosecution built a methodical case. They had testimony from 23 victims willing to describe their experiences. They had financial records documenting systematic fraud and exploitation. They had physical evidence of the reflection chambers and control mechanisms. They had communications between the shepherd and his associates discussing how to manage members, how to prevent escapes, and how to maximize financial extraction from the community. The defense attempted to frame everything as protected religious practice. The isolation chambers were meditation spaces. The financial contributions were voluntary donations. The work was communal effort toward shared spiritual goals. The restrictions on outside contact were necessary for maintaining focus on spiritual development. Prosecutors systematically demolished these arguments. They showed that new members weren't informed about the restrictions and control before joining. They demonstrated that people who tried to leave were physically prevented or threatened. They presented evidence that the shepherd himself didn't believe the spiritual teachings he espoused. His private communications showed cynicism and focus on financial gain rather than any genuine religious conviction. The trial lasted 9 weeks. Victim testimony was emotional and compelling. Former members described the gradual process of being drawn in, the escalating control, the realization they were trapped, and the fear that kept them compliant even as they desperately wanted to escape. The jury convicted the shepherd on all counts. He was sentenced to 42 years in federal prison. His 3 primary associates received sentences ranging from 18 to 27 years. The message was unambiguous. Using religion as cover for exploitation and abuse would result in severe consequences. Civil litigation followed as victims sought compensation for the assets they'd been defrauded of, and damages for the trauma they'd endured. The sanctuary's assets were frozen and subject to forfeiture. The property was sold, with proceeds distributed among victims. But the amounts recovered were insufficient to fully compensate everyone for what they'd lost. For the victims, recovery was complex and often painful. Many struggled to reconnect with families they'd been separated from for years. Parents had aged, siblings had moved on with their lives, and the victims themselves were fundamentally changed by their experiences. Rebuilding trust and relationships required time and effort from everyone involved. Employment was challenging for many former members. Years away from conventional work, living in an isolated compound, left gaps in resumes that were difficult to explain. Some struggled with basic aspects of independent living after years of having every decision made for them by the shepherd and his elders. Several former members formed a support network, helping each other navigate recovery and speaking publicly about their experiences. They worked with cult awareness organizations to educate people about recruitment tactics and warning signs. Their advocacy helped others recognize potentially dangerous groups before becoming too deeply involved. The mother who'd filed the original missing person report was reunited with her son. Their relationship was strained initially, both struggling with years of separation and the changes he'd undergone. But they worked through it with family counseling and over time rebuilt connection. She credited Deputy Ramirez's persistence with saving her son's life, knowing that without intervention, he might have remained trapped indefinitely. The rural community where the compound had been located struggled with complicated feelings. Some residents had interacted with sanctuary members at farmers' markets or when members performed work in town. They'd seemed quiet and devoted, nothing that raised alarm. Others admitted they had thought the group was strange, but hadn't wanted to pry into what they assumed was people's private religious choice. The case prompted discussion about the line between respecting religious freedom and identifying abuse. Religious organizations deserved protection from harassment and interference, but that protection couldn't extend to shielding criminal activity. The challenge was recognizing when legitimate spiritual practice crossed into exploitation and control. Law enforcement developed better protocols for investigating allegations of abuse within religious communities. The protocols emphasized the importance of speaking privately with members, looking for patterns across multiple accounts, and understanding common tactics used by coercive groups to maintain control. Emily, whose escape had triggered the rescue of others, struggled with her own recovery, but felt purpose in having helped free people who'd been trapped alongside her. She'd acted despite enormous fear, climbing out a window in darkness with no certainty of where to go or whether she'd make it to safety. Her courage had saved lives. What had started with a mother's concern about her son's 8-month silence had exposed a 6-year operation that had systematically exploited 35 people under the guise of spiritual community. The numbers told part of the story. 35 members trapped, 23 wanting immediate escape, $3 million extracted, 42 years in prison for the leader. But the real measure was in lives reclaimed from an organization that had promised enlightenment while delivering captivity, in families reunited after years of manufactured separation, and in survivors who'd found the strength to rebuild after having their identities and autonomy systematically destroyed. The compound was demolished. The shepherd was imprisoned. The organization was dissolved. But the impact persisted in the survivors working through trauma, in families dealing with years of forced separation, and in a community's awakened awareness that isolation and control could exist under many names, including those that claimed divine authority.